Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to wait just a moment to allow others to join us, and then we'll get started with today's conversation. Good afternoon again, and certainly welcome to our latest installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today's topic is Investing in Change, How Education Transforms the Lives of Incarcerated Youth. My name is Jaleel Hart, and I have the good fortune of serving as the K-12 director here at the Hunt Institute. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Institute, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, and we're pleased to serve as a resource, a nonpartisan resource for policymakers across the country. We work across prenatal to post-secondary spectrum by hosting convenings, providing technical assistance, and producing research to improve education systems. Before we dive into our discussion today, just a quick note on a few logistics. Today's session will begin with a moderated panel discussion, and then we'll open the floor for participants to submit questions to our panelists. You can do that by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We are recording today's conversation, and we'll post it to our YouTube channel in the coming days for those who would like to revisit or share it. And we do encourage you to do that. You can also join the conversation on social media by using hashtag #EdHomeroom. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. First, I'm very honored to be joined by today's distinguished resource experts. First, we have Dr. Lynette Tannis, who since 1995 has served in a myriad educational roles, including a teacher, coach, literacy coordinator, school and district administrator, professional developer, researcher, lecturer, and a consultant, an education delegate throughout the United States and within 5 continents, Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. She has visited hundreds of schools and classrooms and interacted, trained, and supported many educators worldwide. So Dr. Tannis, we're very grateful to have you with us. Likewise, we have Dr. Danielle Christian, an experienced higher education professional who has served in various roles, including an assistant professor of criminal justice, lead faculty for criminal justice online programs, and course quality assurance coordinator. Before transitioning to higher education, Dr. Christian served as a business and criminal justice teacher at an all-girls college prep high school in Philadelphia. In addition, he dedicated over 5 years to at-risk youth and teens offenders through his employment and volunteer work in Pennsylvania and Louisiana. He is a native of the beautiful Caribbean island of Jamaica. The conversation today centers on a very critical issue: how education can serve as a powerful lever to change in the lives of incarcerated youth. We'll hear about barriers, promising models, and the role of collaboration in creating better outcomes. So with that, Dr. Tannis, we'll turn to you for our first question. Based on your research and experience working in the juvenile justice system, what are the most pressing barriers preventing incarcerated youth from accessing quality education, and how can educators and policymakers collaborate to address these challenges?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the welcome and for having me a part of this discussion. So I think first and foremost, awareness. So, very important to have conversations like this because I still do. It is 2025, and I still run into people who are like, wait, oh yeah, like what are we doing for those children? So, it's sort of like out of sight, out of mind, unfortunately. So I think first and foremost is actually being aware of the numbers of children that we do incarcerate each year. Fortunately, the numbers have and I would say this was around the pandemic during COVID time, just even the number of cases that were being heard across juvenile courts significantly decreased. But we still have just over 400,000 cases that are heard in juvenile courts, and about 27,000 youth who are incarcerated on any given day. And so, one, it's being aware of. And I think the next is also just the belief. Like, do we believe that every child deserves a high quality education? And so if we do, then, we would tap into some of the best practices that we're seeing in traditional spaces and other spaces, along the lines in terms of like policies and just, I would say, just even what educators can do. um, I would link sort of the research that I've done and that I'm still seeing these sort of four components when I visit spaces and work with states. So, based on the research that I did, analyzing facilities, this particular study was done in Florida, and there were four major themes that emerged. And so, for educational programs that showed promise and had a higher quality of education, more students on task. There was importance of relationships, expectations, resources, and accountability. And so first, on the relationship side, I mean, there's sort of a multi-prong there. What's really important is ensuring that the relationships exist between the program staff, sort of the Department of Justice or Office of Juvenile Justice, and the education staff. In the United States, it's roughly about 55% of our facilities, our juvenile facilities, which roughly we have about 1,500, are publicly owned, 45% are privately owned. So the format is very different in terms of who's responsible for education and who's not. And so, with a safety and security focus, for the most part, well, not for the most part, in facilities, safety and security is paramount. It is important that there's also that person who is championing the education side. Yes, safety and security is important. Also, every child deserves a high quality education. And so building those relationships, it's ensuring that there's enough staff, that it's not a safety and security issue, so that the youth are actually brought to class as they should be. The next is actually having the resources that are necessary. We do have some children who are incarcerated who were taking IB classes, they were taking AP courses, higher level courses. And so it's important that they have access to those courses even while confined. We also have a large population of our incarcerated children who, they are struggling academically. Some have left school or been sort of pushed out of school. And so there is a gap that exists. And so making sure that they have the proper resources are really important. And then expectations. So again, this kind of goes back to the belief piece that I mentioned, is if we expect excellence, we will ensure that we're providing that for all children, especially those in a carceral setting. And lastly, accountability. So what accountability measures are in place, both on the outside accountability measures within the state, within whoever it is that's responsible for the provider, and also within the facility? How are we as educators going to hold one another accountable? And so when those four pieces come together, it does demonstrate that children will have at least access to a higher quality education programming.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate you naming those four pieces, but because it's really critical that we have all four, right? If this is not a process or a system in which this chair, for example, can exist without all four of those legs. So I really appreciate you raising those thoughts. Dr. Krishna, I'd like to turn to you next. Based on your experience as a law enforcement officer in the U.S. and in Jamaica, and your continued research, what role does post-secondary education play in reducing recidivism and improving reentry outcomes, particularly for young people in the juvenile justice system?
Thank you for that question, and also thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Tanis because I know she's an expert in the field. I've cited her work, so it's actually a pleasure being here with her as well. So based on my experience, as a law enforcement officer, both in the U.S. and in Jamaica, and now as a researcher and educator, I've seen how powerful post-secondary education can be in changing the directions of a person's life. Um, because one, a lot of we already know, or we should know, from the research that is out there, that these young incarcerated individuals have access to, I would say, lower quality education. So having the opportunity to, for those who have persisted to at least earn their high school education, their secondary education, opportunities should be in place for them to, be able to uh, transition to post-secondary education. And so for youth in the system, education can create a sense of purpose, right? Because it gives them this chance to redefine how they see themselves, right? Because often society and even themselves will see themselves as, as troubled or offenders, right? So we want to move away from that labeling phase and then for them to see themselves as students and professionals in the making. And that's what a post-secondary education can do or should be doing for students. So with that identity shift, I believe that, that's huge. Just imagine being in a situation where educationally you are more at risk. You are not provided with as much resources, like Dr. Tanis mentioned. In a lot of facilities, they will, even from my own experience, prioritize safety over giving students access to certain advanced courses, certain lab-based courses, and so on. So because they're at risk, the fact that they've persisted, it's an opportunity to, continue to encourage them, right? So when they believe that they have a future to work towards, I think they're less likely to reoffend. And of course, a lot of the research points to education serving as a factor in recidivism. Of course, not universally, but it is a great indicator or a great, I would say, uh, factor in reducing recidivism. And it's not just about degrees, of course, because, post-secondary education goes way beyond, just college degrees. We're talking about things like skills and confidence and making those connections, right? So, that post-secondary education can help to build all of that. So whether we're looking at, again, a formal degree, it could be a vocational program, if we're talking about an associate degree, or even online courses, because it equips youth with real options when they return to society. In my own experience working in the juvenile justice system or facility in Pennsylvania, I saw where uh, youth in the system were given opportunity to earn college credits, with local community colleges online, once they've completed their high school diploma. And that has been very you know, transformative for them because when they go back to the society, they are able to continue on to earn their degrees, right? So they would have returned with, more than just a high school diploma. And also in my research, I've seen that education improve employment chances significantly. Employment is one of the strongest factors in keeping people out of the system. However, in my research, I also saw where, again, like I said, having the education or completed education doesn't necessarily universally prevent all, propensity to commit crime. Because I've seen where people who've earned their high school diploma reoffended. So it is a great tool, like I said, to keep people outside of prison. But it's not just a tool for personal growth, but it's also, I would say, a pathway to like long-term public safety.
Thank you so much for that. And just a follow-up question for both of you very quickly. You both mentioned in some way the importance of and the need to ensure that students who are in the juvenile justice system have access to high quality education. And you both specifically mentioned those advanced level courses. I'm wondering if there's some examples that you can name or highlight across the country that are doing this well.
Dr. Christian, you want to go or you want me to jump in?
You can go.
Okay, I'll jump in. Um, yeah, so one thing one thing that has been helpful is like project-based learning at where there is a driving question that the young people have. They have choice in how they demonstrate that they are mastering those standards, and actually having getting feedback and having a public something where there's an audience that comes together is something that across multiple states have definitely demonstrated success. It is, just thinking about feedback that I've gleaned from, heard directly from, and then, just further reflected on from staff, from teachers, from young people. From the staff side, they've shared that there were young people who were in rival gangs, but they were working on a similar project together. They were sharing feedback, and it was very well received. From the teacher side, one teacher shared that normally in one case, there's about 14 young people in the classroom. Usually about 7 have their heads down, 7 may be attentive. But in this case, like, everyone was really engaged. And a young man said, he felt like he actually had a job. Like, he was so excited to work, on these projects. And so that is something, for sure, it is much better than, worksheets in a manila folder, which unfortunately we do see all too common under the guise of individual learning plans. Because again, it is really, really difficult, let's say, for a math teacher who may have ages 12 to 18, depending on the state, 19-year-olds in one room. How do you go about teaching a middle school math, geometry, algebra, trigonometry, perhaps? So being able to kind of look at those standards, it's helpful, kind of to address it through project-based learning. The other piece is some facilities who have done this well really do figure out what the learner needs. And in some cases, they're providing additional time for them, like outside of the class time. There's some facilities that are doing like one-on-one tutoring as well, and making sure that they can, still have access to earn those credits. It is not ideal when someone says, well, how do you take PE on the computer? Like, how do you do that if this is supposed to be physical? So there are still those barriers, but some, I would say, those who really focus and are committed to those individual lives really do take them, see what they have, see what they need, and tap into outside resources, as well as, again, going back to the relationships and partnerships piece, working very closely with that facility director or facility superintendent to say, hey, listen, this child is just 1 credit away from graduating. They need this level course. What can be done? And so those are some of the ways that I've seen it done successfully.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Christian, I'd like to turn to you now to talk just a little bit about some of the long-term social and economic benefits of investing in education for incarcerated youth, both for the individuals and society as a whole. And then how have collaborative efforts with external partners uplifted investments in educating incarcerated individuals and young people?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So I always say that, when we invest in education for youth and more so incarcerated youth, we're not just invested in individuals, but we're invested in safer and stronger communities, right? Because we know that it costs more to incarcerate, whether it's a juvenile or justice involved youth or an adult inmate, right? So I think it's better if we invest in education. So from a social and economic perspective, I think the benefits are pretty clear. Education will help young people to secure jobs, in most cases. And of course, with more education, you have the potential to earn higher income, stable incomes versus, not being formally trained. Sometimes you may not find that stable career. And so you're able to, I feel that youth are now able to build lives that do not necessarily revolve around survival on the streets, right? Or even if they're not on the streets, but maybe working, a job that is not a career, not as stable, like I've mentioned, so you want to be able to secure stable jobs and stable incomes because that will keep you focused And I think this will now lead to less recidivism. We will have, of course, lower incarceration costs because, again, it costs more to incarcerate than to educate. And we'll find that we have more people contributing to the economy instead of being like a financial burden. Because we know that, of course, we'll have more people working, but sometimes, let's say you're not as educated, maybe you're working in a capacity where you still qualify for public assistance. So I believe that education, especially higher education or great vocational training with great earning potential, will sort of lessen that burden on the the public funds. But beyond the numbers, we also see stronger families, right? Healthier communities, and of course, the generational impact that this can make. Because when a person comes out of a correctional facility I would say with their education, like I've mentioned, people who've returned with their high school diploma or GED and also college credits, they sometimes will have a plan, a plan about how they can go back to school, how they can secure that job and then become role model and not like repeat offenders. Because one of the things that I've seen is that oftentimes these individuals end up in these situations because they didn't have that role model, or at least who they had as a role model were not the best examples, And so now when they go back with education and they have a plan, those who are in their surroundings they may now serve as role models for those individuals. In terms of collaboration, so some of the most effective programs I've seen um, are the result of collaborations. In the US, we see there are a lot of initiatives now. Like there's a Second Chance Pell program. I think before you couldn't have access to such programs. So you have more colleges and collaborating with facilities. Even here, I'm in Jamaica, and I see where NGOs they work alongside government agencies to offer, from literacy program, vocational training, and even digital skills. And specifically where I'm at now at the University of the Commonwealth Caribbean, where I oversee the criminology and criminal justice program. We have partnered with correctional institutions to offer incarcerated individuals the opportunity to earn their degrees. So I think that is significant. But overall, these efforts, I believe that they do well when we work together, right? So, I was having a conversation this morning where someone was saying it was on social media, but they were saying that nobody reads a book that researchers have done, people with PhD have done, and and that will help. That they've totally discredited that, but I think that's a poor way of looking at it because I think everyone serves a purpose, those who are producing the research, the educators, the justice official, because we're using, the research that is being produced to make practical changes, right? So developing policies and programs and collaborating with colleges and universities and other institutions to provide programs that are there. So I believe that collaboration is like a real game changer if we want to really create second chances.
Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. So thank you for those thoughts. I do have one more question for our panel, but before we do that, I want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to make sure you ask our panelists any questions you might have, and they'll be sure to answer those as we wind down this part of the discussion. Dr. Tanis, you have studied education models within correctional facilities. Can you share an example of a program that has effectively supported incarcerated youth, and what key elements made the educational program successful?
Sure. So I would say first and foremost, having uh establishing those relationships, and really there is a research article that was done by O'Rourke, and it's titled "Think Exit at Entry," and I think that is just a brilliant motto of like, what is the plan for this child, for this group of learners, so that we're having conversations with them, taking an assessment just in terms of what their likes are, what their plans are. And so I think that has been something that's been in place that has been very helpful, just in terms of like the adults in that space that are focused on their learning. I mentioned the project-based learning before in terms of like, really getting young people to have that hands-on experience and also have that interaction with folks from the outside. So, in one facility, they when they were presenting what they were doing. So, for example, even there was a pair of young men who decided their essential question was, how just is the justice system? They had been in a juvenile detention center for 3 months and still, and again, in our country, we are innocent until proven guilty. So they were still innocent because they hadn't been proven guilty. They had not even gone before a judge or anyone. And so, they were then able to do the research, to see about and learn about other cases that were similar to theirs. And that's what they presented. That particular facility, the educators were there, but also in that space were the juvenile judges and others. And so part of this is not just like learning in isolation, but like, again, similar with what Dr. Christian said, is just making sure that like everyone who's impacted by this is a part of it, right? And so like, how can we, one, yes, get to know what they need, always having the standards in mind, and those within our society who, have influence, we're also tapping into them to make sure that the young people are receiving the quality feedback, that they recognize that there are high expectations and they are going to own that, so that it's not just something isolated. It's not just something going in a folder. They have no idea, or yes, I know I need this when I go before my judge. So that's a big part of it. I would say the other piece that's also been very helpful is that like multi-tiered student support systems. Again, that also is very much aligned with like really meeting the child, the learner, the student where they are. I can't underscore that enough. And then, again, having those relationships, celebrating the young people. Again, for so long, for so many, they haven't had a positive educational experience. There's so many young people who are just like, Miss, I dropped out of school in the second grade. My grandmother got tired of the school calling, and so like that was it for me. And now they're in a facility. Miss, I left the school in the sixth grade, right? And so a big part of that are those relationships. And again, meeting them where they are and being able to celebrate the progress as they go. The last thing I just also want to share, because I also believe that sometimes we as the public or society don't recognize this, that in these spaces, there are people who have their high school diploma or have their GED or high set. And unfortunately, there's nothing being offered for them. So making sure that they do have access to college courses. Again, this is also something that Dr. Christian mentioned in terms of like the vocational programming, etc. The last thing, just to link back, what I really can't emphasize enough is the belief is in a state, as I was having focus groups with some of the program staff, one earnestly responded to a question that I said, and he said, when the kids leave here, they could definitely get a dishwashing job because they wash a lot of dishes. And so knowing that the more we do something the right way, the better we get at something, it is time we increase our expectations for our young people and decide, what are the top 10 or top 20 fields that are in need of minds and hearts, and what can we be doing while they are confined so that when they leave here, oh, definitely they can get that job.
Thank you so much. A lot of what you said resonated, particularly the article that you mentioned. So we'll try to make sure that we get access to that so that we can share it out with folks as well. So thank you for that. We do have a couple questions in the chat. And I think, Dr. Christian, this one is for you. This says, I have background in both education and workforce development. And this could be for either one of you, but I think, Dr. Christian, you talked a little bit about this. What models have you seen that combine those two institutions to meet the needs of incarcerated youth? And what recommendations do you, for doing that, do you recommend for eliminating the silos of the two? Again, that can be for either one of you.
Okay, yes, I can address that. So I think that's a great question, right? Because, we want to see how we can integrate them, right? And so I think when I think absolutely educational workforce development work hand in hand. I'm all for, like hands-on, and especially in correctional facilities. I've seen in Pennsylvania when I worked with justice involved youth, where they had opportunities, to to combine, the things that they were learning in the classroom with some hands-on opportunities, whether it was building trades classes and so on. So one model that I really admire, which kind of bring that career academy approach, is Youth Build. So I believe that this is one of the great program, because what it does, it bring educators and employers and community colleges and so on to the table. I would say earlier than later, and again, I think that is great. But I would say, to break down the silo, I'd recommend. One of the things, of course, is planning, and of course, funding structures that actually require both education and workforce agencies to collaborate, right? So not just to coexist, because we see a lot of that in juvenile justice and criminal justice broadly. There are a lot of different, I would say, partner is not the word I'm looking for, but different people having different roles, but they just seem to just coexist. They're not necessarily partnering. They're not committed to like the shared outcomes, and that is so important, right? So, workforce, education, right? They both have to come together. So perhaps instead of, maybe we're just measuring high school completion, what if we also track job placement, right? Or probably college enrollment, maybe 6 months after they've been released, right? Whether we want to do this for those who maybe had already started college in the facility, or do this for everyone. Once you've completed your high school diploma and you're going back, or your ISET or your GED. So those are just some of the things that I think that we can do to sort of bridge the gap, right? Instead of acting independently.
And just to add to that, just more, I guess, on a technical side, what I've seen across some states is actually building these into the schedule. So whether that is they're taking their core courses in the mornings and then focus on their vocation or workforce piece in the afternoons, or having a Monday, a sort of 4-day in the classroom, and then the one day is like really focused on that workforce piece. But again, so that it's not feeling sort of piecemealed or feeling siloed, the more that entire piece is the vision for what the need is, and then being able to create that schedule so that it flows in that way, I think could also be helpful.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, many incarcerated youth have experienced significant trauma and disrupted schooling. How can education programs inside correctional facilities be designed or reformed to meet their academic and social emotional needs effectively?
Um, yeah, so that is very valid and real. As I think about that, a data point that comes to mind is based on a study that was done in Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. When they assessed the young people who were incarcerated, it was determined that 96% of the young people had experienced one or more trauma, 84% was two or more, and 56 or 57% was six or more traumas. So that is very valid. I'm also thinking about a young man. I won't name the state, but there is a juvenile facility that actually there's a state rifling range that shares a parking lot with that facility. And so I was there on site, and I'm hearing this like pow, pow. And part of me is thinking like, well, I know the doors are pretty heavy, so maybe it was the door. And I turned to one of the staff members and I was like, "Was that was that the door? Like, was that?" And they said no. They confirmed that it was a rifle range, and I was like, "Isn't that traumatic?" Yes, we just had someone on intake who had just been shot, so we have to get earplugs for him because, like, every time so unfortunately, I guess this kind of goes back to the why of these spaces, right? So yes, we as a nation used to incarcerate many, 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 many young people, and then it was like, well, maybe we really shouldn't be doing this. Like, what are some alternatives? And so, like, that's a great thing that alternatives were explored and being implemented, so the numbers are fewer. But in reality, unfortunately, in many of these spaces, the traumas continue to exist. So you know, most programs have therapy and some therapeutic sessions. There are some who have like group and circle ups and things like that. So there might be group counseling and also individual counseling. The smaller the facility, again, depending on where you are, but based on the research, it's it's more likely to have a more therapeutic environment when there are a few individuals versus 40 plus in the cells and all of that. So I just want to, at least just for the visual piece, just to understand, just even the facility could make a difference. Um, and yes, sometimes there are pieces on the education side where just even being involved in some cases, different arts programs that are brought in, that does provide, whether it's visual arts or performing arts or music, that also helps to provide some sort of therapeutic piece, in terms of that trauma piece. And the counseling can also, help with that. But, that is a reality. And again, I just want to emphasize why the positive relationships really also matter is for those young people to be connected with, as Dr. Christian said, whether it's a mentor or someone else from the community, that can also help on the treatment side for the trauma.
Thank you so much. And I want to stay with this relationship piece just a little bit. How do we recruit and retain highly qualified educators for these roles, especially given the importance of relationships and expectations?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry, Dr.
Sure. How do we recruit and retain high quality educators for these roles, especially if relationships and expectations are so important?
I'll jump in. So I how do we recruit? So one, I think part of it is like people really knowing what it is. So, within the 50 states, about 16 of our states, it is the Department of Education that's responsible for education and facilities. Another 16 or so states, it's the Department of Justice or Office of Justice. Another handful is like the Health and Human Services, and then a couple states kind of have their own districts. So part of it is just like, where does someone go? Some people in your depending on the state, it might be the Department of Health and Human Services. Well, if you just completed a teacher program or whatever the requirements are, you at least have a bachelor's degree, you're planning to go alternate route, but now you want to teach in a space, you don't necessarily know where to go. So I think part of it is like one of the recommendations that I've made to states is, especially if it's not the Department of Education or the local school district, that they would really partner with that Department of Juvenile Justice so that one, there's just even the awareness of these positions that exist, so that it's posted on both websites, not that someone has to kind of hunt through and find. Another thing too is just the training and preparation for this space. There was a study that was done regarding like retention of educators in these spaces, and you know it's heart alone is good. Heart is good and important, but that alone is not going to be what actually has people staying. It was actually shocking to see that it's most people kind of stayed looking at almost like the advancement of their career. And some of my graduate students, we kind of, grapple with this because they're like, no, you shouldn't be doing it for that. But in reality, based on a study that was done, it's like that's what led people to stay. And it's like, well, maybe that helps them sort of focus because it is difficult. It's trying, especially depending on where you are, being searched every time, and just all of the barriers, that challenges that do exist. And so I think one, like, yes, being aware of where those are. The other is, thinking about who are our incarcerated population, and knowing these are the children. For the most part, we are pushing out of our traditional spaces. So like the 2% perhaps that might be in a traditional school, charter school, private school, what have you, this is like 95% of those 2%ers, right? And so like making sure that, you're reading and researching and learning about how best to serve these young people. Those are the things that really do matter. Having that professional development ongoing is also very important. So I would say, partnering with um, folks in traditional spaces, also knowing this is a population with a large special education population. And so, being able to connect with folks who, even if you're not in these spaces, just to be able to learn different strategies and techniques that work, that those are the things that can be very helpful.
Uh, yeah. If I might just add, yeah, I think, those are some great points. And especially, talking about the partnership and the professional development is so important. But even just coming in, I think I would say purpose, like purpose is so important because, I've worked in one of these facilities, and you have to really be passionate. You have to really care about these young people to really be committed to going there every day. Like Dr. Tanis says, going through the security and all the extra steps that maybe you're going to, if you go to a traditional school to teach, you wouldn't have to encounter, such extra hurdles, right? And so you really need to have that purpose. But also, I believe that I think it's important. Of course, you can be, perhaps you're not trained in special education or so on, and you may, at some point in your career decide that you want to work with these individuals. But I think that it is important that, facilities really recruit, people who have the experience, whose teacher training program would have prepared them for, special education, people who've probably had trauma-informed practices in their background, and so on. Because I think, like we've mentioned before, and like I always say, or we always said when, I worked in a juvenile facility, that all our young people, have experienced trauma. The mere fact that they are in a juvenile facility is trauma enough, and of course, a lot of them already came to the facility with trauma. So, trauma-informed practices are so important to be aware of, if you're coming to a facility, to become an educator. But also important, and again, having that ongoing professional development. But we need, I would say, support. Support is so important because, of course, yes, you found the right people with the background, and you've offered them the position. But how do we keep them? Retention is so important, and that comes down to support, right? So having, realistic class sizes, right? So manageable, hopefully smaller class sizing. We talk about the professional development piece, but also mental health support for staff, right? Because these facilities can be very trying for the staff as well. No matter how passionate and committed you are, you also need to have that support, right? So mental health support is also important for those who are working in these facilities. And yeah, so I think that, those are some of the things to consider, if you are interested in going that path. And then of course for those who are looking to recruit, not just to find people who are qualified, but also providing them the support once they, are working in these facilities.
Thank you so much for raising the point about trauma-informed care and practices, because I think that's a really critical piece that's missing, not just in terms of educating youth who are in the juvenile justice system, but even our traditional schools. I think a lot of teachers are graduating without that kind of instruction and that kind of practical knowledge. And then they're entering classroom with students who all have different kinds of trauma, different levels of trauma. So I really appreciate you naming that. Um, Along the lines of those gaps in understanding and resources, what funding or resources, additional gaps in funding and resources exist in providing quality education for incarcerated youth? And what strategies have been effective in securing those funding resources for those necessary supports?
I am someone who I feel like, of course, the more money anyone has, I think is a great thing. Um, I also just want to say that, on average, there it's about $241 a day to incarcerated youth. And then the Justice Policy Institute did a study called Sticker Shock. This was in 2014, but they looked at the juvenile facilities that were maximum risk, like the highest in terms of security levels and all of that. And that average was $408 a day. So I'm naming those dollar amounts because I just have to say, like, money is there. I think it's really important that we look at, like, and yes, of course, that goes to salaries and other things, but I have been at facilities where sometimes there are more adults in the space than there are children, right? Than there are young people. And so I think part of that is, again, going back to, like, what is it that is needed? Like, what is the program overall that every young person is going to come through and receive and need to receive to be successful when they transition out? What are some of those, again, this goes back to the multi-tiered student support systems, but, like, what are the other pieces that, oh, we just had this young person come in and they need this, right? And so we know we have to provide some very targeted and specific resources for this young person or this cluster, right? And part of that is then looking at, and what is the cost for that? I yeah, I think it's really important to really truly, like, look at the budgets and the numbers, and really see what is being allocated, because it is 2025 and there are still states here in the United States that they, even with the funding, they do not utilize a custodial care or anything like that. It is the young people who are responsible for cleaning the space. It is the educators who are responsible for cleaning their classrooms and other things, which would not is not the case outside of these carceral spaces. So I think for sure, like, looking at the funding and actually looking at what is being allocated. And again, since education does matter, ensuring that the education dollars, education budget makes sense and is where it needs to be to provide the the educators with the professional development and training, as Dr. Christian, underscored, and the young people with the quality education programming they deserve.
Thank you for that. And I have we've talked a lot about what happens when young people are entering into these carceral spaces, but we haven't talked much about how we can better support the transition from those back into traditional public schools or vocational training or higher education, whatever that space is. Could both of you kind of talk about how you think we could better support students transitioning from these correctional education programs to these more traditional programs and workforce training and programs like that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. And in my own research, looking at um, high school completion among former justice-involved youth, one of the things that I focused on because I wanted to know was, what was the transition like? They've earned their high school diplomas, high set, GED, and so on. How, what's the transition like? And I think it comes down to reentry planning, right? I think we have to be intentional about not just ensuring that they've completed their education, they've completed the treatment aspect of their programs to be released into the society, but what happens after, right? And I think this is where the facilities need to be intentional about creating partnerships in the community. So whether it is ensuring that they have access to, and I've seen it where they've done that. So they've put things in place for, those who are going back to the community who will still need that mental health support, that they have partnered with NGOs and so on, so that they can continue to have that access when they go up there, or if they need medication, that is in place. One of the things that I didn't see a lot of, at least from my, what I was able to see working there, was transitioning in terms of education, because a lot of, the research indicates that a lot of justice involved youth do have an aspiration for higher education, but I don't think that facilities do enough in terms of assisting them with applying for college, because it's new. A lot of this is new, even for traditional and prepared students. But the thing is, they have their college counselors in high school. For me teaching in high school, I saw that they have all these resources in place for them to apply, navigating the common applications and all these wonderful stuff. But for justice involved youth, they don't have that, in the facility. And then when they go out, they don't have the resources, they don't have the information to navigate it on their own. How do they apply for financial aid and so on? So I think that, we can do much better in terms of setting them up for success, especially as it relates to further education, whether it's vocational training or higher education.
And just to add to that, if that's okay, right before the pandemic, at the Nancy B. Jefferson School in Chicago, which is a school housed in the juvenile detention center, they actually were able to hire transition coordinators who helped to bridge that gap. And additionally, with the Chicago Public Schools, just from the restorative practices model, once the young people, once it was determined what school they would transition back to, a team would go with that young person, meet with the school leader, whoever else was there as well, to again have kind of like a pre-conference to help set that young person up for success. So I think that was definitely a positive example. Again, having transition coordinators, unfortunately, it's almost like guidance counselors in some of our traditional schools in the United States, where sometimes it's like 800 to 1. And you're grateful for that one, but it's like, all right, we need a lot more. Unfortunately, it's like that in some spaces where you might have, say, 700 young people who might come through a facility for an entire year, but just one person who's serving as that transition coordinator. Just kind of linking back to policy, I think, making sure that we are looking at the policies, because in some policies, it is that no one from the facility can follow up with the young person. Like that is actually written in policy. And in a way, it is designed to protect that young person. But at the same time, especially when you're working with the young person around applications, around other things, it's like kind of like, all right, did they get their driver's license? Do they need anything? And so I think it's time we actually encourage those positive relationships, at least that they have someone that they can connect back with at the facility who can still be that liaison, who can still kind of help make those community connections. And then just lastly, I just want to say, in a lot of spaces, there are different things called like treatment team meeting or something like that, where there is a conversation with young people when they leave out. And so it is really important that the folks who are going to be involved, who are involved in that young person's life, are a part of those meetings, whether in person or virtually, so that there can be the right plan and supports in place for them to be successful.
Thank you so much for that. And as both of you were talking, a lot of what you said resonated with me, because when I think about the special education process and how in traditional schools, we often allow students, if they're of a certain age, to be engaged in those planning processes from middle schools to high school or elementary to middle. So I can see the value in that. So I really appreciate you sharing that. But I want to thank both of you so much for such an incredible conversation today. You have raised so many great points and shared so many resources with our participants today. So thank you for doing that. Before we do close today, I want to share a few of our upcoming additional webinars that the Hunt Institute is hosting. The next webinar is going to be on May 15th, and it's hosted by our higher education team, and it's about promoting post-secondary college enrollment. So if that interests you, I highly encourage you to register and join that conversation. Likewise, you'll find on that website all of the other webinars that our early learning team, higher ed, and my K-12 team are all hosting in the coming months. So you can register for those on the website. So in the meantime, I wish you all well, and thank you again for joining today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Have a
Thank
great day,
you.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.